Yes, could you please come up to the stage? 네, 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수 보내주십시오.
Thank you so much for your time today. I'm looking forward to talking to you about the work that I've been doing for the past 8-9 years, pre-generative AI, on ethics and risk in AI deployment, specifically thinking about the implications for business and society. Not many people know who this man is, and he actually is the reason why the modern world exists. And you might think, well, if he's that important, then how come we've never heard of him? Well, I'll tell you a story about who he is. His name is Stanislav Petrov, and in 1983, he was a member of the Russian military. His job, we would say today, would be to be the human in the loop. And his job, if the missile warning system went off, would be to push the button to get the Russian nuclear weapons launched. Now, one day, he's sitting underground at his job, and suddenly the alarm bells are going off. Apparently, the United States has launched a nuclear weapon. Now, all of us in this room know that that never happened, and that was not true. But in 1983, sitting underground in a bunker, he didn't know. But luckily, he used what human beings do best. He used his independent judgment and thinking. And he thought, well, there has been no escalation in the Cold War. There's no reason the United States would launch a nuclear weapon. And he thought, I wonder if this early warning system is broken or malfunctioning. And he didn't do what the human in the loop was supposed to do, which is push that button. And I like this story for two reasons. Because number one, it shows us that even the most advanced technology can fail in ways that human innovation cannot. But number two is that the human should always be in the center. How do you learn that from this story? Well, because the rest of the story is that he was actually punished. Because if you've served in the military, you know that your job is not to question the information that comes to you. You are not supposed to take independent action. And actually what he did, even though he was the human in the loop, his job was not to make an independent thought. So I like to think about this when we think about AI systems, because we use these things, we talk about human plus AI, but have we meaningfully thought about what that means? How do we construct human plus AI relationships so that human beings are taking action and not just the recipient of what an AI system tells them to do? If it is not built into your institution, just like with Mr. Petrov, then human beings really cannot take action without having some sort of negative repercussion. So what do we talk about when we talk about AI? Now, maybe a lot of people in this room are familiar with AI systems, but you may not be familiar with how AI is built. So these are headlines that you have probably seen just opening your phone and looking at your daily media. AI is just as good at diagnosing illness as humans, and maybe the solution to our education crisis is AI, and lawyers will be replaced by computers. Now, I'm going to share with you one very interesting fact. Every single one of these headlines came from before 2020. This has nothing to do with generative AI. These are the headlines that existed about what we would call today machine learning and narrow AI. So we have had this conversation about AI for some years, and yet none of this has really happened. We're seeing the early days. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But one thing I want to point out with all of these sentences, the AI system is talked about as if it has free will and intention. And it's something I call moral outsourcing. I have a TED Talk that I gave in 2018 about this topic. And the concerning part of this is that when we humanize AI, when we talk about AI systems as if they have wants or desires, or they are going to be an educator, or they want to replace a lawyer, we miss the fact that human beings are the ones actually making those decisions. A computer does not want to be a lawyer. A startup founder creates a law tech AI startup that then does the work of lawyers. And I raise that because there's a lot of intention that goes into how we build the technology. So what people tend to think AI is something like these robotic images, because you may see in movies or in TV shows. And people who are unfamiliar with AI are understandably frightened because between those headlines and these movie images, it looks like robots are coming to drag you out of your job and sit in your desk and write your emails for you. When the reality is, if you're somebody who builds AI systems like I am, AI really is just code. It's lines of code. And specifically, it is math put into code. These are not magical thinking systems. These are complex mathematical models that are able to do incredibly impressive things. But what they don't have is agency, autonomy, and independent thought. So when we think about technology, often the way technology is framed is if it is better than us, smarter than us, and we need to run behind it to catch up. But again, human beings make these technologies. And what you often see is that technology's failures are actually pushed on people, and we are expected to adjust to the limitations of the technology rather than saying the technology's role is to serve humanity. And again, this is a very intentional discussion. This is a second story for you. So there's something very interesting about this car. And this is a very early concept car for a self-driving car. And there's two things that are incredibly notable. Number one is that the seats are all facing in. There is no driver. And number two, there is no steering wheel. So the earliest concepts of self-driving cars looked like kind of what all of us think about or used to think about, which is that, it's sort of like an individual bus. And you're going to wake up in the morning and there'll be a car outside. You'll go into your car and you can do your emails or take a nap while it drives you to work. And instead, the reality is that we sit in self-driving cars with all of the stress of driving, but none of the agency. So if you're familiar with any of the self-driving cars, and you own self-driving cars, you know that you still are a driver. You still have to have your hands on the wheel. All of the tension and stress of avoiding a car crash is actually your responsibility. And most, quote, driverless cars, even if car companies can define self-driving in a more and more limited fashion, getting us away from that image that we saw on the previous slide and more towards something that is legally suitable, we are quite far away from that fantastical image that we had. And I love this phrase by Dr. Madeline Eilish, who's currently at Google DeepMind. She framed it moral crumple zone. It's when human beings actually are meant to absorb the liability of the negative outcomes of these models. So cars that have failures, one of the reasons why there is a physical driver is that then the responsibility is on the human driver, even though you have less and less control. So remember, going back to Mr. Petrov's story, you're punished for being the human in the loop. And in 2018, there was a self-driving Uber that hit a woman in a crossroads. And guess whose fault that was? It was not Uber's. It was not even the engineers. It was the self-driving car's driver. So then what do we do? Do we then create new systems of roads to limit the number of accidents because self-driving cars can't seem to not avoid them? Knowing that the best way for human beings to live is something known as the 15-minute city. And this was an idea that cities like Paris embrace, which is that everything you need in life should be within a 15-minute walk of where you live. So in one world, we have these quote-unquote self-driving cars where you and me and everybody else sits in traffic for multiple hours a day, which is a very unfortunately common practice in America, which we know is counter to the other viewpoint, which is better for human beings, but maybe not ideal for technology. So what does it then mean when we're building this technology? One of the common phrases we use is that, we're building for the average person. And I just told Jim that I'm really glad he raised this idea of average in the very beginning of his speech. So machine learning and AI models are actually quite good at finding the median, finding the average, and patterns in data. If there's one thing that they are better at, that they've always been better at, right? Even in early days of tree-based AI models, they were always better than human beings at finding patterns. They can parse through information and identify things that are similar to each other. You can find lots of signal in noise, and actually they can be somewhat consistent. And as a result, we're actually able to take massive amounts of data and say, what is the average experience or the average person of a particular type? What do they want to see or eat, or what kind of clothing would they buy? This is the basis of things like recommender systems. But let's talk about this idea of average. And even personalization models, the name is a little bit misleading, because what a personalization model does is it takes all the data points about you and me and everybody else, and puts us into a category and says, somebody of this category type, what might they like? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about average for a minute. So I'm going to go back in time. One thing I do like to do is actually give stories about things that are not related to modern technology. There is such a AI exceptionalism where we talk about AI systems like they're something new, when actually there are so many things to learn about historical examples. So in the 1940s, the United States Air Force needed to revisit pilot seats. And in the time between the early days of aviation to the 1940s, fortunately, human nutrition had improved, food science had improved, and the average American pilot, who was a young man, probably between 18 to 30, was just bigger, and they were uncomfortable in their seats. So the Air Force commissioned projects to create a new seat. And the airline companies, the airplane manufacturers, did the same thing that they had done 20 years before, which, from an algorithmic perspective, was actually quite smart. They had 10 different measurement points, and across over 4,000 young men, had measured and taken the average, and they built a seat that was the average measurement of these 10 points. And then they built the seat and found that it suited nobody. Not a single pilot who tested those seats liked the seat. They all thought it was uncomfortable. And that's because this average, much like my colleague Jim said, is actually a fantasy. One can have one's head in an oven and your feet on ice, but on average, your temperature is fine. Well, and same thing here. You can take 4,000 young men and measure across 10 points and take the average and still end up with a seat that literally suits nobody. So what did the government do? And you don't have to read this big wall of text, I'll explain it. So they went back to the airline manufacturers and said, what we want you to do is make a seat not that suits the 50th percentile, the average person, but a seat that serves 95% of all of our pilots. So that statistically is a different way of looking at things, right? So basically it's saying that whatever seat you make has to actually fit 95% of people. And again, this is actually quite a homogenous group, right? These are, again, young men, particular age, etc. So we're not talking about a big diversity of body type. And the airline manufacturer said, we have no idea, we can't do this. Never been done. We don't know what you're saying. It's going to be too expensive. We're going to go bankrupt. The US government said, well, if you want to do it, here you go, you should. And, we'll find somebody who does. And that is actually why we have adjustable car seats. We have adjustable plane seats. And everybody from a woman of my size to somebody who is 6'3" is comfortable sitting in a wide range of vehicles. And all it took was the institution in power, in this case the US government, to push back and say, we're not going to actually accept an average solution that fits nobody. You actually need to make a solution that fits 95% of people. So what are the key takeaways? Well, in order for AI to work, we have to think about how we customize to the individual. And that is not something you can throw at an algorithm. It actually requires human innovation. You have to think through who's responsible, who's building it, and what is the technology for. And then also, you have to invest as much in the human side to get the benefits of AI as you do in the technical aspects of building AI. So on the next part, one of the biggest questions I get asked is, how will AI impact the future of work? And I will say over the past 2 years, I've done a lot of talks on the future of work. 2025 is the first year it is the #1 topic of conversation amongst all kinds of age groups. I speak at universities, HR fora, I speak at board meetings. That is the #1 question on everyone's mind. And I'll present to you 3 papers that have come out in the last a little over a year that have really talked about, from the biggest macroeconomic global picture to individually at your workplace, how AI systems will impact work. So the first is this paper by actually a professor at MIT whose class I took many years ago, Darren Acemoglu. He's a labor economist, and he wrote this paper called The Simple Macroeconomics of AI, which is quite a humble name for a very well done paper. And actually, rather than saying AI will replace every single job, what he sees is that the impact of total factor productivity is less than 1%. So if you added up all of the production over 10 years of every country, his take is that AI will automate less than 1% away, which is actually still a very, very big number. It sounds small because 1% is actually a lot. That's a pretty big number. But also he's saying that, and importantly, that it's really the business jobs and not the worker jobs, the blue-collar jobs. We usually think of technology automation as taking away manual labor jobs, and that's because every previous wave of technological innovation has automated manual labor. It's making shoes or building a house or whatever it is, right? Even a car is the automation of a horse's labor. So we took manual labor and we automated it. AI is the first time we are automating knowledge work. And that is really why a lot of people are so concerned. This is why it's impacting researchers and paralegals and journalists more than it's impacting factory workers or plumbers. And in fact, when we talk about Gen Z, we find that there is a rise in young people who actually want these manual work jobs. They want to run a business in air conditioning because they see possibly more of a future for themselves than in an office job that they fear will be automated by AI. Well, the second paper came out, it was written by OpenAI a few years ago, right after ChatGPT came out, so 2023, and it's called the GPTs are GPTs, an early look at the labor market. And the important thing of this paper is that their estimate is that actually about 80% of the workforce will only have 10% of their work tasks automated, but there is about 19% that'll see about half of their work automated. And they did this by sector. So again, the impact will be uneven, and it won't be that every single job is automated. And actually, for most people, it's really a productivity tool. But there will be certain sectors very significantly impacted. And again, it's research, paralegal, journalists, anything that's sort of entry-level work. And I'll say that this is the first year, 2025, where we are really seeing AI impacting entry-level jobs. Young people are having a harder time finding their first job because they're often things that we can use AI to do. Basic research, basic coding, that kind of thing. So the third paper I really love, this came out this year. It's by Harvard Business School, Procter & Gamble, and it's called The Cybernetic Teammate, a field experiment on generative AI reshaping teamwork and expertise. And the big takeaway is that human plus AI is better than human alone or AI alone. Now, the next few slides are a bunch of charts. I will just explain them to you. So the first one, so what I like about this paper is they actually designed this as an experiment in Procter & Gamble. They do a 2-day competition, basically, where they split people into groups, where there's people, there's individuals, there's teams. Some people get AI, some people don't get AI. And what I like is that often a lot of the analysis of AI's impact on the workforce looks at productivity. We know that AI can be infinitely productive. It doesn't mean what it produces is any good, right? People use the phrase confidently incorrect to talk about AI systems. And that's because they have no problem producing 24 hours a day, but often it needs human intuition to look at it and make actually some sense out of it. So they look at more than just producing. They look at time to completion, quality of task, and importantly, whether or not expertise is needed. Because one of the conversations about AI in the workforce is that we are no longer going to need specialization or advanced education. You can take anybody, put an AI system in front of them, and they will perform as good as somebody with a PhD in the field. So they look at all these three things. So the first thing they look at is, how does the average solution quality, how is it impacted? Well, we find that individuals and teams without AI don't perform as well as individuals and teams with AI. That's sort of a taken. This is a really important one. This is the core jobs. Do you need to be an expert? And actually, it's pretty stark. You actually do need to be an expert or have some understanding of the field to benefit from using AI. You cannot just take an inexperienced person, put AI in front of them, and expect the quality of output to be high quality. And I feel like we all intuitively know this, but it's good to see the actual data, the empirical evidence of this. And the last part is about time saved, so time to completion. It's interesting because it's a bit of a mixed picture where people are saving time, But with the individual plus AI and team plus AI, but teamwork always requires consensus building. I think sometimes technologists, we get a little ahead of ourselves in efficiencies, but also, again, we don't want to do that at the expense of quality and consensus building. And then, finally, where did the high quality solutions come from? So remember in the previous slide, we showed that teams still did take a little bit longer. However, their output was the best. So when you take a group of people who have knowledge in a field and you give them an AI system, they may not produce as quickly as an individual with AI, but their outputs are actually overwhelmingly, according to this analysis, their output is much, much better. So when we think about how we get our future workforces really thinking about AI systems, utilizing AI systems, I think a lot about digital literacy. Now, the concept of literacy or AI literate has been around for quite some time, and to be honest, I find it quite misguided. A lot of it seems to think that everyone should take a programming class because if we all just knew the magic of Python programming and Jupyter notebooks, our lives would be infinitely improved. And actually, as somebody who has been programming for many decades, I don't actually think that's the case. So let's think about what it means for everybody to be digitally literate. Now, the best book written about this, remember I like using historical examples, the best book written about this was actually written in 2003. And it was written by a professor of literature. His name is Stuart Selber, and it's called Multi-Literacies for a Digital Age. And he wrote this book for English majors to understand this new crazy thing called the internet. And how would they be literate in an era where they didn't handwrite their prose and instead used these computers and keyboards and did their research on this crazy, unreliable online internet that was completely unregulated. And his words actually hold quite true. So he divides people into three categories and the type of literacy that's needed. So functional literacy, critical literacy, and rhetorical literacy. If you are functionally literate, you are somebody who is just using this technology as a tool. So you are the average recipient of an app or somebody who's playing around with ChatGPT. And your job is to actually effectively employ it. So what does that mean specifically? So when you're using this technology, if you want to be literate in it, that means you're actually using it in your day-to-day, you're learning to build and use these tools, but also, importantly, how can you engage with the technology rather than as a result of the technology, right? Do you conceptually understand how it works and also are able to discern good and bad output? That makes me, again, think of the example of Mr. Petrov. The second is critical literacy. So this is, for example, if you are working at a government institution or a company that deploys or uses AI in some capacity. Your job is to actually interrogate whether or not the product is robust. Does it do what it is supposed to do? And the entire field of AI assurance has actually been big and quite growing because of that open question. So specifically, you need to be able to answer the question, how do I know if something goes wrong? Can I challenge the system? Where do I report any issues? And how can I get them fixed? And the last category is actually the smallest category of people, which are the builders. So these would be people working at frontier AI companies or specifically making these AI applications. And it's interesting because the closer you get to the technology, you notice the more philosophical or sociological these questions get. Because the kinds of questions you ask yourself when you're a builder is actually asking, how does my product interact with society? Where does the power lie in the system? And who does the system benefit and how? So I really think about this quite deeply as somebody who has been across many different industries. I think my introduction had sort of mentioned this. I built Accenture's practice in responsible AI. I led the machine learning ethics team at Twitter. And in the Biden administration, I was the first US AI science envoy. And what that meant is that my job was to go to governments all around the world and really talk through and understand how they are building and adopting AI systems. And one of the things that I like to bring into the room is how do we get forms of feedback from people in a way that is useful, meaningful, and actionable. Again, as somebody who's been on the builder side of things, unsolicited feedback often is very useless, or it is framed in a way that is not actionable. Like I can't do anything with it if someone is saying that I don't like this. I don't know what to do. So what I really think about is how do we construct methods of measurement that really get at the public's perception and real use of these AI systems. So how do you meaningfully create human in the loop? So I wrote a paper a few years ago based on my time at Accenture where we looked at organizationally how you can build a responsible AI, both internally and externally. And structured public feedback, one thing I built during my time at Twitter was the first algorithmic bias bounty. If you're familiar with cybersecurity, the idea of the bug bounty is not particularly foreign, but it had never been brought to code before, where a company actually opened up their code and said, find issues with our code from a perspective of algorithmic bias or discrimination, not just cybersecurity. And if you do, we will give you prize money, etc. So it's the first time that had happened. And then in 2022, I established a nonprofit to literally do this work. So we work with companies, organizations to actually create these kinds of global challenges to solve meaningful problems. Just as an example, we did one last year with the Indian Forestry Service on creating more inclusive reforestation algorithms that would take into account the migration patterns of tribal nomads, which is very, very fascinating work. Structured public feedback, I mentioned earlier, AI assurance, is actually a way of getting good feedback to understand if your model is performing as expected. So one of the issues with generative AI models is that the output is not easily predictable. So machine learning models are mathematical, statistical models. 2 + 2 always equals 4. In generative AI models, the output is probabilistic. So 2 + 2 generally equals 3.5 to 4.5, but sometimes it equals 99. And as a business, it is very, very hard to understand the risk of launching a generative AI algorithm if you don't know if it's going to give useful feedback 100% of the time. So what I've done is built out 3 methods of doing this sort of evaluation. The first, as I mentioned, is bias bounty program. The second that I'm particularly well known for is red teaming. So red teaming similarly is a way of bringing in external experts and individuals to give you feedback on model performance, but specifically testing the model to the edge cases to find problems. And again, this is another practice borrowed by cybersecurity. It's a common practice that there are independent evaluators who can be hired by companies with the sole purpose of testing their models from an external expert perspective. And I'm trying to bring that into AI models. And what we're the most known for is doing the largest ever generative AI red teaming challenge, where about 2,700 people at the cybersecurity conference, DEF CON, were introduced to hack every major large language model. We worked quite closely with the companies to do this. What I really love is that when we do these evaluation exercises, we work with the model owners because they are constantly trying to improve their models from all sorts of perspectives. In this case, we did it based on the AI Bill of Rights, which was written by the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, which covered everything from privacy and discrimination to data exfiltration and personal information. But we've also did one with the National Institutes of Standards Technologies where actually anybody in America could give feedback so that NIST could create better AI standards. And that had never been done before. Nobody had ever gone out, given an algorithm to literally anybody on the street and said, give us feedback, and that feedback directly is structured to help us create better standards. So this isn't a survey, this isn't a questionnaire, this is actually getting your hands in the code. And that's actually one of the biggest gifts of generative AI. I mentioned I've been in this field for about 8 years, and until 2022, I would have to explain to people what AI is because it was such an abstraction. They had never really seen it, or at least they didn't think they had seen it, even if it was behind the scenes making decisions about jobs or mortgages or their child's education. They had never really seen, or they didn't think they had seen algorithm before. So what ChatGPT did is it put AI in everybody's hands. And now people were asking the right kinds of questions. They were asking questions like, why is this often so wrong? Or why is it presenting this situation in a way that I know is factually incorrect? Or I know that the output shouldn't look like that because that doesn't sound, that sounds discriminatory. How do I fix this? How do I improve this? And those are the questions we just certainly want asking. So the average person doesn't often get the opportunity to do this. So that interaction, the ability to interact with this model is something that I want to take and give to everybody in a way that is meaningful. So creating an AI right to repair. How might the average person be part of addressing this kind of AI models issues? Red teaming is a starting point, but as we think about agentic AI, if we want people to use AI to make decisions on their behalf, then we really do have to think about ways for people to be able to repair the AI systems that interact with them. there's no way the average person will trust an AI to do their grocery shopping for them if it can't tell a banana from an avocado, right? Or if it will spend $5 on a single banana and not make a discernment about what is cost effective or not, right? So this idea of a right to repair is, still a bit of a dream, but it is one that we are working towards. So what's next? Everybody in this room in some capacity is interested in the future of work and human resources. And it is worth your time to invest in understanding AI. Specifically as a productivity tool, I use generative AI to do a lot of tasks. And there are many ways in which I like working with Gen AI, but also recognize that it is meant to augment the work I do, not replace the work I do. And also when we think about deploying AI at your organization, what is the intersections of your pain points and what AI is good at doing, rather than assuming the AI will just automatically be good at anything you want to use it towards? And importantly, how can you use AI to solve problems positively and productively? Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. And now we have some questions for you. So first question is, in the global movement toward sovereign AI, which reflects each country's language and culture, how can education help students develop a balanced sense of both technological sovereignty and cultural identity? Please answer it.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So actually, I have a recurring article in the Korea Herald, and my previous article, actually, I just published one today, but there was one from a few months ago where I talk about sovereign AI. Now, Korea has actually made a pretty significant investment in sovereign AI. And it's quite a broad term that not just means ownership of building the AI model, but also ownership of the data centers, data sources, and every end, so end to end. So right now, today, countries often rely on cloud compute that might be owned by Amazon or Microsoft or Google, and it's really a move away to bring everything home. And from an educational perspective, technological sovereignty and cultural identity is actually a very interesting way to think about sovereign AI. Well, first, because again, one of the goals of sovereign AI would be to bring matters of economic production home, right? So other than the US, there really are not major powers where the fundamentals of AI are built, right? So usually a lot of the benefits of AI at some point goes back to Silicon Valley, and sovereign AI is a bit of a pushback against that for all sorts of reasons. But in terms of students learning about AI, learning how to use AI, I think one thing is quite important. Your AI may be sovereign, but it needs to interact in a global environment, just the way that we can all be citizens of the country we are from, but still be respectful and knowledgeable about other people's cultures, traditions, and values. So it introduces actually a quite human problem into a very technological construct. So yes, you can technically own all of the data and the data centers and the cloud compute in Korea, but whatever models are built still need to interact in a global setting. So as you think about values of these systems, they may be different from the values of other systems that are being built. But again, for these technologies to be truly global, there needs to be some idea of values interoperability. So again, as students are thinking about technological sovereignty and cultural identity, it is important to think of how you can understand the value of these systems at home, but how they interact with systems being built abroad.
Thank you very much. Maybe one last question. So you've emphasized co-creation between humans and AI. So could you share examples of governance models or participatory design frameworks where diverse communities, not just technologists, actively shape how AI systems learn and evolve?
Yes, that is literally the purpose of human intelligence. What I love about the work we've done is we demystify not just AI, but we actually demystify AI evaluation for a broad range of people. We worked with the company Autodesk with architects and engineers on the concept of creativity and intellectual property in AI systems. So whether or not they can use AI systems to help them as they do their concept designs without it actually violating intellectual property. We actually held a red teaming evaluation with scientists with the Royal Society of London on mis and disinformation. This is a really fascinating one. So we brought in epidemiologists and climate scientists to test meta models on whether or not they will produce misinformation related to issues of COVID and climate change. And one of the reasons why I like to bring in a wide range of people is it always follows the same story. And this is what I mean when I talk about giving people agency, autonomy, and a right to repair. So the first thing they say is, oh, I'm not an AI person. They think they don't belong in the room because they don't build AI. And I remind them that actually they're not there. We have plenty of people building AI. That's not the issue. The issue is actually we don't have enough epidemiologists in the room explaining to companies how these models should be talking about COVID treatment, or we have enough AI people doing things like that. We actually need the scientists in the room. Well, and the second thing they do is they put their hands and they start actually putting their hands in the code. They interact with the model, and then they start to see all of the issues, because again, they're approaching it as an expert. So you and I actually may not understand the difference because we're not trained scientists in these fields. But they do. And then when they start to see it from their perspective as an expert, then they start to understand why these systems can be flawed. And specifically, and the third part that's interesting is they start to point out issues that as a technologist I would never have seen. Because again, I am not the climate expert. I am not the epidemiologist. That's not what I'm the facilitator. So I learned so much from being in these conversations. So with that Royal Society Red Teaming event, what especially the climate scientists were pointing out is that there is a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of propaganda out there, and actually the internet has more propaganda than it has actual scientific research. So if you think about how these AI models are built, they're built on the data of the internet, all the freely available data, because none of these companies paid for that data. So they scrape the internet, they scrape Reddit, etc., compile that information. Now, that's fine for many things. It actually doesn't work for science, because scientific articles are usually owned by journals, and journals are not free on the internet. You have to pay for them. So what is out on the internet for free? Well, that's actually all of the policy and propaganda being made by organizations that maybe are pushing back against scientific research. So what these scientists were finding is that these realistic looking studies that were actually falsified or like misinformation were more prevalent because the real scientific data is not what's available on the internet. So that opened up an interesting question that, again, unless you were a scientist really thinking about it this way and able to discern the quality of information, you may not have seen, because, again, misinformation is very, very convincing. So that was, again, just one thing that I learned quite deeply from bringing in a wider range of people. And these are the kinds of things you learn when you do this kind of testing. Truly, it's, the human race is actually quite a positive. We're very positive people. So even though, and every single time we've done this, even though we bring them in to find issues and flaws, where it ends up is once they find the problems, the first thing we want to do is fix it. So these scientists sitting in this room saying, well, these are the problems. They're like, oh, what if we start building these models with these scientific journals and trying to make specifically trained models where the information is better vetted. And this is the point of doing this. The purpose of bringing in diverse communities and not just technologists is that more people want to be in the room solving the problem. They're not there to critique or find problems with it, and actually they want to see the benefits of this technology used positively. So again, actively shaping how these AI systems learn and evolve is more than just saying we need, more compute and faster GPUs and better chips. It's actually saying how do we meaningfully bring experts, like people who truly have the expert experience or lived experience, to help shape these models in a way that actually makes more sense and that human beings can benefit from.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you.
I think that it's time to wrap up the session. So thank you once again for your insightful presentation. 네, 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수 보내주시죠. Thank you so much for being here with us today. 네, 루먼 초두리 최고 경영자님께서 두 번째 기조연설 전해주셨습니다. 답변까지 정말 시간 가는 줄 모르고 열심히 들었는데요.